because the Bible doesn't tell us, except the fact that he went out all over Egypt. But he has to have a purpose for that, so we conjecture what it is. He is evidently looking at what he has available, trying to decide how much of this property is going to be devoted to raising corn and so on, and how much land can people give for the making of these huge storage bins, because you're going to have to start laying up for a period of 7 years of plenty, laying up for the 7 years of famine that's going to follow. So, we find, now back to verse 55, 41:55, when all the land of Egypt was famished. Notice how that word comes from the same word, famine. That's when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. And you knew that was coming. One person said they began to complain, because that's what people do when hardship sets in. You complain to the government. After all, the government's supposed to take care of you, isn't it? Well, that was a thought then. That's still pretty well the thought of a lot of people today. It's the government's place to take care of me. Then the government has to decide, well, you probably ought to work. No. 2 Thessalonians has not yet been written. That came along centuries later, where Paul said, if a man won't work, which means if he doesn't desire to work, he just doesn't wish to work, which ultimately means he would just rather you take care of him and pay all his bills. But there's nothing right about that. People are not obligated to help other people except those who are totally incapable of supporting themselves, either mentally or physically. Then yes, we are obligated to step in and help out. We're obligated by God to do that because of our neighbor. Our neighbor is anybody that we can help. Remember Christ's parables. Okay, back to chapter 41. Verse 55 says they began to cry to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh says, this is the easy way out. Go talk to Joseph. He's the one that I put in charge. And whatever he tells you to do, you do it. Number 1 says, check with number 2, because he's in charge. That's basically what's happening here. It wasn't only in Egypt. Look at verse 56. The famine was all over the face of the earth, all the surrounding territories. So Joseph, after the hardship set in, probably a number of months later, I don't know how many, but they had plenty for 7 years. They had an abundant harvest, and now they're living off of the excess of that harvest. So the famine was all over everywhere, and then Joseph, who's in charge, decides to open up all these storehouses. And he began selling, we'll talk more about that in a moment, selling this corn and other grains perhaps, because the famine was so bad in Egypt. But not only there. Verse 57 says, all countries, plural, came to Egypt to buy corn, because the famine was so bad in every land around there. That simply means then that all parts of the world then was having difficulty, especially since they had not made provision for the 7 straight bad years. Of course, they didn't know. I mean, how many people pay attention to warning signs? Pharaoh would. He had been warned by Joseph. But how long does it take for people to wake up and find, today we say wake up and smell the coffee. How long does it take for them to realize who's really in control and what's going on and why is all this happening to us? None of them had made provision. Evidently living pretty high on the hog, we say. And famine was setting in even 250 miles north in Canaan, where Papa Jacob lives still. The father of all these boys that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. Okay, it appeared to people even far away as Hebron up in Canaan that Egypt seems to be the only one that has any excess to sell. So they became concerned, and the government in this case really was capable of helping them. Most times that's not the case. But here they were, right, because they'd been preparing for it for 7 years. And so Joseph waits evidently until as long as possible. He waits before he starts opening up the storehouses. So that would probably mean still a number of months that they could live off the excess that they'd stored individually, farmers. But now you've got to provide food for more. Now notice the Bible says that, verse 57, these nations came down to Egypt to buy corn, purchase corn. Famine was so bad in all the land. All right, now we got that. Why did Joseph wait as long as possible? Well, because he knew what was going to follow. 7 bad years. They probably knew little about the second part of that promise or interpretation of dreams. So Joseph is trying to conserve what's available, even in those storehouses that the grain was stored in. He was waiting as long as possible before he opened them up, so people could still live on what they had made themselves excess. And finally he opens it up and allows the people to buy grain, even his own people in Egypt. Now that brings up another question. All of those people, even today, who may wonder why Joseph did not simply give the food to them, made them pay for it. All of those individuals who advocate public welfare and want giveaway programs, that's what Joseph is going to have to put up with. He's waiting as long as possible before he opens it up. And he is in strict control of the supplies. I would imagine nearly every day was like the day prior. Going out, checking the storehouses that they had, how much grain was left, how many more, at least 6 more years probably, when he starts checking. We have enough grain for 6 more years. And how many nations do we have coming in and purchasing grain? That's going to lower the amount that we have. I mean, these are all thoughts that any individual, probably you also wondered about it. I know I had. But Joseph says you've got to buy the grain or the corn, whatever type it might have been. And the reason, well, the vast supplies that they had built up over 7 years of plenty, that has to be carefully controlled. There's that idea that a lot of people don't like, except when they're in control. You have to control it. You don't just let people come in and take whatever they want and leave. This was one way to help control it. Had it been simply given away, that would be rewarding short-sightedness. It would be rewarding people's laziness and refusal to work. So he implemented a charge. Okay, now, I imagine that probably didn't go over very well. I mean, how many people really enjoy paying taxes today? We're going to have to pay for all this wheat that we stored up. They probably thought, it's ours, we ought to have the right to squander it and use it as we want. But Joseph had a plan. Of course, God was behind it. They're not going to be rewarding people's indolence and their refusal to work. So what was going on here? Well, it was right and the proper thing to do, what Joseph did, and that is to sell the grain at a nominal expense, and some kind, probably, again, there's that word, probably some kind of rule was implemented where those who were truly in poverty and had nothing, zero, would be taken care of. And that's still what we had, we called it a safety net. Probably that's what's going on here also. But the rest of the people, maybe he gave them government jobs. It might have been the case that some of them were in the construction business, making a little money on the side. Well, they ought to be paying if they're making any money. So across the board, some kind of program was going to require rules. Okay, now, famine in all the other lands was going on. Some of them were making their forays or their trips down into Egypt to buy corn. So they have to buy it. The people themselves in Egypt had to buy it. News reached them eventually that, hey, down in Egypt, they've got a lot of supplies. Well, of course, they're the ones who already knew about what was coming. And so these other nations began sending in caravans to go down into Egypt and buy the corn. And that would eventually, as you would expect, that's going to include Jacob and all of Joseph's brothers making some kind of an appearance down in Egypt. So by the time that this famine came, let's take a look at some time issues now. By this time, Joseph had already been down in Egypt 20 years. And probably he never received any word from his dad, Jacob. Never received any word from the brothers who sold him into slavery. 20 years went by when he was all on his own. What was he doing? Well, some of that, we've already had. He was in Potiphar's prison, that Pharaoh's prison house that Potiphar's in charge of. Part of that, when he went down into Egypt, he was just 17 years old. When he appears before Pharaoh, he is about 37 years old. 20 years. Depending on if his birthday is the first part of the year or the last part of the year, I don't know when it was. He was either 37 or 38 years old. So now the brothers are coming down into Egypt, and the plot thickens. In Genesis 39, 40, and 41, those three chapters are dealing with the experiences of Joseph down in Egypt during that 20-year period. Now, he was 17 when he was sold, and he was in Potiphar's house 13 years, so add those up, and that counts the prison time. So you add another 7 years to that, because that was the 7 years of plenty. So now how old is Joseph? About 37, possibly 38 years of age. I don't know about you, I keep going back to the time element, how old people were. That to me is an interesting feature when you begin to add up the years. Because we're going to see later that Benjamin, who's still back home with Dad, he was on up to about 22, maybe 23 years of age. And Joseph now was 37 to 38, nearly 20 years older than, less than 20 years older than his young brother Benjamin. Okay, now, Joseph had been in Potiphar's house and in prison for 13 years, and then another 7 years here make up for being the second in command down there in Egypt. I was thinking to myself, the Bible doesn't say this, but I think it leads to this conclusion. One thing he was doing down there, besides exercising political power because of Pharaoh, he had to be learning the Egyptian language. And that's not easy. But you're going to find out later that when his brothers appear before him, they don't understand him because he's speaking Egyptian. And that leads to more intrigue. So the family then was having hard times, and they decided that, you can have great wealth, and Jacob did. He had huge flocks of sheep and herds of cattle and other types of wealth. But with a drought or famine that has so seriously damaged the entire economy, what good does it do to have a lot of wealth in the bank when there is no grain to buy what good your wealth's going to do you? You got to have food. So that's the issue that they're facing here. Okay, chapter 42. The time is about 1707 BC, still 1700 years before the time of Christ. It began to be obvious to Jacob that we can't keep going on like this. Our supplies are getting lower and lower and lower. We're going to end up starving to death. We've got to do something. He has to be talking to his boys this way. Well, the 10 boys. I don't know exactly how old Benjamin is at this time. But Reuben was the oldest, and Simeon next, and then Levi, and then Judah, and you know, 4 different mothers producing 12 different boys. Well, it had to start clicking. We got to do something. What are we going to do? Look at verse 1, chapter 42, verse 1. When Jacob saw or realized, when it fully impacted what was going on, hit him, he said, sons, there's corn down in Egypt. I like the phrase or the sentence that he made then. With supplies down in Egypt, why are you sitting here looking at one another? He's already talking to them. We're going to have to get some help. And probably they thought about, they may even thought maybe we, as much as I don't like the possibility, I might have to go down to Egypt. Maybe each one was thinking that. But the dad says to his boys, why do you look one upon the other? You know what we have to do. And probably each one of them was sitting there silent, not saying a word, and according to the Bible, they began looking at each other. Okay, Simeon, what do you think? Reuben, what about it? Judah? So Daddy says, why do you all sit here and look at each other and not do anything about it? We've got to have some responsibility. And he said, I've heard that there's corn down in Egypt. Go down there and buy for us from there that we may live and not die. The situation was getting in dire straits. We have to do something. We can't continue doing nothing. Our supplies are practically gone. We can't last more than another week or two. We got to have help. So the 10 brothers, verse 3, went down to Egypt to buy corn. You know there's a lot more happening here. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion between those boys outside the earshot of Daddy. So the statement here in verse 3 probably covers a number of days. They're going to have to prepare, get ready like they're going on a vacation. How long does it take you to prepare to go on a vacation? These are normal people. They're going to have to make preparation. So anyway, now they're leaving. Except one. Verse 4. Benjamin did not go. And that was because of Daddy Jacob. He is not allowing his son. Notice both of those boys, Joseph, who's already down in Egypt in power down there, and then, 17, 18 years younger, would be would be Benjamin. Dad's not about to allow Joseph's full-blood brother, Benjamin, go. He said, I don't want any peradventure, mischief. I don't want anything to happen to him. How long has it been since some of you have entertained this concept of, we don't want you going by yourself. Rather have somebody with you. Reason I bring that up is because it happened to me last night. If I were to go somewhere, there is so much mischief going on. There are so many bad people out there. There's the possibility of having a wreck and landing in the hospital. He was thinking about all these things, and he calls it mischief. I don't want mischief to happen to Benjamin. Okay, now, verse 5. The sons of Israel had to go. I mean, there was no question about it. Jacob was too old. Benjamin was too young. So those other boys, all, 10 of them would have to go, minus Benjamin or minus Joseph, who was already down there. So Benjamin was going to stay home because Daddy wasn't going to take a chance on anything happening to him. He'd already lost Joseph, remember, that's in the back of his mind. And Rachel, that was Joseph's mother. Well, she had another boy named Benjamin, came along later, and she died during the birth process. So these two boys appeared to be Jacob's favorites. Okay, these boys were having to leave, and the Bible tells us in verse 6, Joseph's brothers came, and I've marked this one, bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. When I read that, what's the first thing you thought of? I think I already know. First thing that I thought of, which is exactly what Joseph had dreamed years earlier. His brothers were going to be bowing down to him. His daddy would be bowing down to him. And they became angry. The very idea, we're going to bow before you? Who do you think you are? Here it's happening. They come down into Egypt, and the first thing they do is they bow themselves down to the ruler in Egypt. Joseph, you know who it is, but they didn't know who he was. Okay, this is that which Joseph had dreamed, and that's what the Bible says. Look at verse 7. He saw his brothers, he knew them, but he made himself strange to them. When you make yourself strange, what do? You disguise yourself as much as possible. If you have time to prepare, you'll grow a beard. You will perhaps discolor your face, so any feature that would hide who you really are. They were not odd, strange. They were simply non-recognizable, strange. Okay, now, they're down there before Joseph, and they bow down to him. And Joseph, it said, he knew who they were, but they did not know who he was. That's verse 8. That caused Joseph to remember, just like I did, and probably you did. That caused Joseph to remember this is what he dreamed about was going to happen. Now it's happening. My brothers are bowing down before me. Even Jacob was somewhat taken back when Joseph told him the dream about the sun and the moon bowing down before him, as well as the stars. And they understood that to mean his parents, me, Jacob. Well, that's what's happening. So what does Joseph do? Well, it's all part of his plan to disguise himself, but he has more involved than that. We'll talk about that in a minute, but notice, immediately he says, they just met, they did not recognize him, he did recognize them, and now he says, you all are spies. You come down here in order to determine what our weaknesses are as a nation so that you can take over. You're here to spy out the country and to see the nakedness of the land in which you come. So everybody that came into Joseph's presence now had to bow. That's what they were doing. Except one, of course, and that's Pharaoh. He didn't bow down to Joseph. He said, you will be in total control of the country over everything except one thing, and that's me, the Pharaoh. But everybody else, they're going to bow down to you. Go back to verse 41. I'm sorry. Chapter 41, verse 43. Well, let's back up a little bit before 41. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, Joseph, I've made you head over all of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and he put it on Joseph's hand, and he put him in fine clothing, fine linen, gold chain around his neck. I mean, this boy's a slave that's been in prison. He was snatched out of prison because the butler says there's somebody down there, Pharaoh, can interpret your dreams. From prison to the second highest in command in the land of Egypt. How's that for a promotion? Verse 42, 43. He made Joseph ride in the second chariot now, which he owned. And they cried before him, the people did, bow the knee. And Pharaoh made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Everybody had to bow. And Pharaoh said unto him, I am Pharaoh, without you no man is going to do as much as lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt without your permission. We noted last week, obviously, that is simply a figure of speech. We use figures of speech every day, one form or another. This was a figure of speech. I mean, you don't have to say, Pharaoh or Joseph, I need to use the restroom, do I have permission? They didn't have to do that. But probably to use an outhouse or some kind of a toilet, they had to get up and move. So they would be moving a foot and a hand, obviously. But Joseph, the point here is Joseph was totally empowered as the second ruler in Egypt. No one was free to do whatever he wanted to do in the way of making decisions without Joseph's consent. And of course, if other matters come up, he would appeal to Pharaoh. Joseph would. Okay, now, Joseph did not make himself known to his brothers. He's still disguised. He's still speaking Egyptian. But he had learned Egyptian over, 10 or 15 years. You can learn to speak a language pretty well. You may still have a brogue, but you can learn a language well enough, even if it's Egyptian or Hebrew. So Joseph did not make himself known, but rather he decided to act very harshly with his brothers. I don't really think that means that he was getting revenge. I think what's going on here in his accusing them of being spies and so on, he's got a definite purpose in mind. I think he wants his brothers eventually to recognize and to repent of the actions they had taken regarding Joseph. But he's going to use Benjamin to bring that about, probably. Okay, now what's happening? Well, they say, we've come down here just to buy food. And he said, no, you've got something more undercover than that. You're down here, you're serving as a spy to find out how strong we are as a nation. They continue to insist, no, we come for food and food only. Now notice that we're going to have a question later. Jacob gets upset when he talks to these boys when he gets back home. Why did you even bring up the subject that you had a younger brother, Benjamin? Why did you even bring that up? Well, now, this is before that question is asked. We're going to look at some of the answers here. The brothers insisted that they'd simply come to buy food, and not only that, but Pharaoh was quite inquisitive. He wanted to know some background. He asked some questions about the family. I mean, Joseph is simply a slave, and here is the Pharaoh of the nation talking to you. They're asking questions, and here's what they told him. We're just brothers, 10 brothers. We all have the same dad. Well, that's true, Jacob. But notice the hint is we don't all have the same mother. All of us are the children of 4 different mothers. But he said we all have the same father. And that's verse 13. Sons of one man, Jacob, who's up in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father. That'd be Benjamin. He's still back home with Daddy. And the other one is not. The other one, who could that be? Well, that obviously is Joseph. They were talking to Joseph and didn't know who he was. But they said, one is with our father, one is not, and here are the 10 of us down here. So that's the family. They didn't know that Joseph was dead, of course, and he wasn't. But they had implied that he was dead to Jacob, didn't they? Whenever anybody for years would come on the scene and know and realize that Joseph was gone, hey, where's Joseph? They're bound to ask that question. And the most convenient answer that they could give was, he's passed away, he's died. That was a lie. That was a cover-up. They'd sold him as a slave into Egypt. But anyway, the reason for this family relationship being told was to convince the governor that they were not spies. And they just laid it all out, and they happened to mention Benjamin.